This screen tutorial is basically just to recap what we covered over today. So if you weren't here or for some reason your machine wasn't working or your Dreamweaver application wasn't working, here we'll have it for you and basically what we covered. So I have a folder here and you should have access to the Year 1 server that you can utilize to grab the files that I was using earlier. If you want to start over and try it again, remember repetition is always a good thing. Excuse me. So Jewelry Website is the folder that's on the server, and that's the folder that I'm going to be working with today. As you can see, I have my directory sort of split up into design files, which I have a PSD in, and I have HTML, where basically my website is. So we're going to look at both things here. The first thing that I'm going to look at is the PSD, and this is just our design mock-up here. And this is basically what we're looking at here. Which you should be familiar with. In this PSD, typically what happens when you're doing a sort of a mock-up for a client with PSDs is you'll divide up the areas of the website into layer groups, and hopefully everybody's familiar with layer groups at this point in time. So I do have a section here for header, which if I turn it on and off, there's the header area. I do have an area for the content, which if I turn that off and on, you'll see. Inside of that content folder, though, I do have some more subsections as well. So I have the About section, which is at the top, the 6 steps, which are right there, and I have the comments, which is closer to the bottom near the footer. So I can close that all up, and everything's contained inside the content area, which is kind of nice. I also have the footer area. Okay, so we talked a little bit about Photoshop mockups as far as getting the images out and ready for code. So this is where we introduced a tool called the Slice tool. It is the 5th tool down. It's usually your crop tool, so if you just open that tool up and select the Slice tool, here you can see that your cursor changes for one into the Slice tool, and you can click and draw slices just as easy as that. Once you've created one, the cursor does change into the Slice Selection tool. If you don't have that tool engaged though, and you hold down the Command key, you can see that my cursor is actually changing. Hopefully with the screen recording you can see that. But if a slice is selected, it'll automatically change to the Slice Selection tool. If you double click on a slice, here's where you can name it. For one, it's good to name all of your slices accordingly. You can also see the width and the height of the slice as well. So you can fine-tune this with pixel precision, essentially. We don't want this actually sliced just because it's just white space, so I'm just going to delete it. I do have some slices here, though, already made for you. If I double-click this one, it's the header PH slice. And this is basically just a placeholder graphic, and what we're going to do next week is we're going to build out this menu, and we're going to build out this sort of area inside of the header area as well, using CSS, background images, etc. So I'm just going to close that for now, but as you can see, it's 1920 by 800. Okay. If I look down further in this PSD, there's a couple other slices. There's one here, this little squiggly line, and if I double click on that to open it up, I've called it horizontal rule, and I can see that it's 67 pixels by 9. If I wanted to change that, I could definitely. I also have these icon sort of slices made up as well, because these are the things that I want to pull out of this PSD and have in my images folder, in my website folder, for us to be able to use with HTML. And as you can see, each one of these icons is named accordingly. I have icon underscore whatever the icon is. This is just kind of nice because if we look at the file directory here in my images folder, you can see that everything is kind of grouped together. So make sure your naming conventions count. We haven't made a concept in Photoshop yet to export, but I just wanted to talk about it just for a minute. Okay. So if I was going to save these out, I could go up to File, Save for Web, or what is the Save for Web right here, or Shift Option Command S. I know it's kind of a long sort of keyboard shortcut, but you will get used to it if you're using it a lot. Here is the dialog here. I can zoom in and zoom out using my keyboard shortcuts. The Z key is for your magnification tool. I can also click my Slice Selection tool. So I can select this slice here. It's highlighted when it's basically kind of in focus. Down here where it says JPEG, you can see that if I was going to save this as, let's say, a GIF, the file size will change. So for a GIF, it's 840 kilobytes. With a JPEG, it is 410. So make sure that you're using the correct sort of compression or sort of, the right file type for the right job. So the rule of thumb is photographic sort of graphics, like this one up top, for instance. A JPEG would be best suited. But if I look at these graphics down here, so I'm going to select this icon here, and I can see the JPEG is 4 kilobytes. But if I change it to GIF, you can see that it's 1.871 kilobytes. So not a huge deal with broadband of now, our present internet, but if you're loading 200 of these, it's going to add up. So just make sure you have the appropriate sort of file saved out. As you can see in our example that we're working with today, they're all JPEGs. I just did this to quicken the process along, but just keep in mind in the future we'll be wanting to save graphics out of this Photoshop file as different file types for different sort of applications here. So the rule of thumb is anything that looks kind of vector-based, like these icons, there's not a lot of color information, so I wouldn't want to save it with JPEG compression. I'd want to use GIF compression, just because there's less information put into the file. Okay, so that's a quick intro to slices. We'll get more into that later, but we're going to jump ahead to the actual HTML portion. So here I have Dreamweaver, and the first thing that you do with every site in the beginning is define a new site. So hopefully you're comfortable with that at this point. If I go new site and give it a name and point to our HTML folder, because that's going to be our parent directory for our website, that's what we want to do to define a site. After we've done that, you'll see that I have index.html, an images folder with my images that I can work with really quickly, and my CSS folder as well. And this contains my styles.css file. So everything should be showing up in the Files panel if you've correctly defined your site. It's essential that you define a site properly, and only the files that you have prepared are in this Files panel. Okay, so the other thing that I've done here is I've just opened up this index.html file that I've kind of put together for you. Now, the reason why I did that is I just want to see how many people are kind of up to speed and how many people need to be kind of brought up a little bit further. When creating a website based on a concept like this Photoshop file, it's important to kind of lay out your HTML first. I always say that. So do the markup first in the HTML and then worry about the styling. You can go back and forth. That's not a problem, but it's kind of a good idea to get a good workflow going. So I always start with the markup, which is the HTML, and then I go over to my CSS and start hashing that out and give it a look and feel for the different kind of containers. And what I mean by containers are the div tags. So div tags, we should know at this point that they're just containers. They don't have a width, they don't have a height, they don't have a background color, they have no styling whatsoever by default. It's up to us using IDs or classes to style these with CSS, so cascading style sheets. And we'll get into that in a minute here. First, let's look at this code here. The first thing that I want you to notice is line 6. This is kind of universal for linking a style sheet to an HTML document. You'll see this a lot. If I go over to my CSS designer, you'll see that I do have a source here, and that's styles.css, and that kind of exists right here. That's basically telling it that it's linking to the style sheet, which if I go into my files panel here, I can see. So the first part of this says CSS, which stands for the shoulder, or the folder, not the shoulder. The next part where it says slash, and then the file name is this right here. So it's basically just linking that CSS file to this HTML so I can start styling things. Okay, so get used to seeing that. If I was going to start kind of from scratch, I'll just delete this line real quick here. I'm just going to get rid of it and save it. And then I'm going to go back over to my CSS designer, and there is no sources right now, but there's a button that says add a new CSS source. So if I click that, I get some options here. I could create a new CSS file. I don't want to do that because I already have one, but there's attach existing, which I have in my files panel. So I'm going to say attach existing, and then it comes up with a browse button, and I'm going to go find that file that's in my CSS folder. So I'm just going to click that, and I can hit open, and I'll hit OK. And then you'll notice on line 6 that piece of code comes back into play here, and I now have a source over in my CSS designer panel. So today we're going to be kind of hopping back and forth between this WYSIWYG that Dreamweaver gives us and the actual style sheet that I've started to make out for you. And we're going to be adding styles to each of these IDs. Okay, so the IDs, remember, start with a hashtag. The classes start with a dot. And of course, we can always style a particular HTML tag, which I've started to do here with the body tag. Okay, so the rule of thumb between IDs and classes are IDs happen once in a page. For example, I won't have more than one header. Okay, so I'm safe to put ID equals header. I won't have any more than one header container, so I've used an ID. If there is an instance in the page, like let's say, I don't know, a couple different paragraphs that share a similar trait, like red text or something like that, I'm free to make a class at that point. Because it's going to be used multiple times in a page, I'd want to use a class. Again, I guess it's just to make everything so confusing. I don't know. I don't know why it was written that way in the rule book, but it is, unfortunately. So that's the difference. So I've already got some IDs here set up, so we can start kind of fleshing this out, giving some widths and heights to the header, the about section, the footer, etc., etc. So just like this Photoshop file here, I've kind of made a section for header. I've also, in my HTML code, made a section for my header. And what I like to do, and you don't have to do this, but I really do advise it, is use something called a comment. And that's right here. So line 10, line 14, these are comments, and they're just written this way. The greater than, less than symbol with exclamation mark and two sort of, what do you call these things? Just the lines there. So we want to use those just to section out the different areas so we know what's going on. These will not show up on your page at all. It's just for the coders to be able to see what's going on. So as you can see here, I have an about area. And if we look at the Photoshop document, there's my about area right here. We also have a how area, which is right here. We also have a comments area, which is right here. And we have finally the footer area, which is right here, this dark gray area. So that's basically the markup. And as you can see, I have the div ID equals header, div ID equals about, and these are all different, okay? And they're only going to happen once in the page. So let's start with, let's say, the header, because I like to work from the top of the page down and from left to right. So let's start with this header. And for this part of the assignment, you only have to do the background image for the header. Like I was saying before, we're just going to put this in as a placeholder, this top area, and then next week we're going to work on getting these navigational elements in there with some rollovers, and we're going to actually link them to some things. Okay, so just this will be a placeholder for now, but we're going to style this area, and we might work on the footer today as well. It's up to you to try to hash out this area here, the how, and this comments area. So bring that to class next week, next Monday. Okay, so header area. First thing we want to do in CSS Designer is make sure the appropriate source is selected. We only have the one style sheet. You can have multiple, depending on the size, I guess, of the website. You could have multiple style sheets, essentially. It's all about scalability. So you could have a style sheet for type. You could have a style sheet for just the layout. But in our example here, because it's only going to be a couple pages, I'm going to put everything in one style sheet. Okay, so as soon as that source is selected, you'll notice down here in selectors, I have all of my selectors that I've created. And if we actually look at our style sheet here, it's just basically a mirror image of how the CSS is written. So you can see header, header container, about container, how container, comments container, footer, and footer container. So now I can click on any of these sort of IDs and start styling it with the properties. So right over here. So we're going to start with the header area, and we're going to say that it's going to be a height of, and if I go over to my PSD here and check my selection tool, I can see that the height of this area is 800. So I'm going to give it a height for now. Typically, height is driven by content, but in this case, just because it's a background image placeholder, I'm going to put the height in. So instead of auto, it's going to be pixels, and it's going to be 800 pixels. Oops. Okay, so there's that, and as you can see in my actual style sheet, it's written that CSS in there for me using this WYSIWYG editor. The next thing I'm going to want to do is come over to my background tab in the properties. I like to give things a background color if they're going to have an image, just as a fallback. Let's say, for instance, the JPEG that we're going to be using for the background image doesn't load for some odd reason, and maybe there's a server error. At least you're going to have a background color, so we'll just use black. I'm going to hit enter, and as you can see again, there's my CSS rule right there. Okay, so for the background image, I can click, and there's a little folder icon that says browse. So I'm going to browse for the image that I want to use, and whoops, click it again. And here's a little browser, and I'm going to find that header pH, which is 1920 by 800 pixels, and I'll hit OK. And as you can see on line 12 here in my CSS, it's actually written it in for me, which is great. That's what I want. What else can we do here? Because we want this to be fairly scalable, if I resize my browser window, I'm going to say background position, not percentage, background center. And what this will do, because I've given it a height as well, and center, let's actually preview this in a browser now. So making sure I go File, Save All, and then going Preview in Browser. I'll preview it in Chrome, it's my favorite browser. There it is. So if I resize my browser at this point, it'll actually sort of center the image. If I hadn't put that center on, it would have just stayed left and top align, this whole image, and if I made my browser different, it would have just stayed put. So we definitely want this background centered. Okay, so the next thing is we're going to give a width to this header container, because if I look at my Photoshop document here, we do have some content in here, and by the looks of it, it's around, I think we used in class 900 pixels, so yeah, 900, let's see what that looks like. That's good enough. We're going to use 900. So this area in here we're going to define as 900 pixels wide, and we're going to center it. As you can see, it's inside of the header div tag, so this is kind of that nesting sort of scenario we have going on. One div around everything, and then a div inside of it called header container, which we're going to give that width to. I mean, we could exclude this step for now, but it's kind of important that we figure it out. So again, I'm going to click on CSS Designer and select my source, and then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to choose header container, because that's what I'm going to start styling. So instead of auto, we're going to choose pixels, and the width is 900. So after that, I have to center something, I have to say margin left and right auto. So that's the next step, to center a div. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as selecting the div and saying center like a word editor would do it. So I've done these changes. Let's go over to our style sheet just really quick over here and see what it's kind of done. So header container is, the width is 900 pixels, margin left and right auto, and that's what we want. You won't see anything in the browser, but if I do put any content into this area right here, it'll definitely be centered and 900 pixels wide, okay? We're going to actually do this for the next example down here, and you'll see what I mean then. I just put it in just to kind of move things along for next week. Okay, so I'm happy with what I have going on right now. The next portion is, if we go from top to bottom, excluding the navigation, is the, what section? The About section. So, and I can see that in my code as well, so About section. Here's a little tip with Dreamweaver. What I like to do is, if I'm done with an area, I'll highlight it all, including the comments, and I'll just use these little braces and close them up. Okay? So I'm going to close everything up except for the section that I'm actually working in. This calms the code down in my eyes, and it's just a little easier to work when things aren't so sort of messy and crazy looking. So now I'm going to start concentrating on the About section. Okay, so let's look at this again. We can see that there's going to be definitely two columns here. So one for this tag, or this content, and one for this content. After you kind of learn the principle of how to set columns up with divs, then you're pretty much off to the races. You'll be able to code all of this no problem. It's just a matter of kind of repetition and doing it a couple times. You will get that aha moment where you're like, oh my god, this is really not that hard. And when that happens, it's really exciting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this content here, copy it. When I select this text in my mockup, which the client has signed off on, I know that I'm using Myriad Pro Regular. It's 48 point, which I believe converts to pixels. Let's have a look here. I'm going to unselect my text here and go into preferences and just change the units to, instead of points, we're going to say pixels for the type. And I'm going to select that text one more time and see what it gives me. Okay, so it is 48 pixels. We also know that there's a color involved as well, so I can use that in my CSS to make it look more close to this concept that the client potentially could have signed off on. Okay, so I'm going to come back over to my code, and in the about container, which we have not styled yet, I'm going to paste that content in. And remember, white space is okay. Totally fine with that. Our interesting history should be all capitals though, so I'm just going to rewrite it. Our interesting history. And again, I've pasted this in, or typed it in. I still need to wrap this in a tag, so it looks like to me that this could be a heading tag. So we're going to use an H1. So I'm going to type that in. Whoops, no, we want capitals in your tags, so that's the naming convention that we want. And right away, we're going to close that tag off. So it's a good thing to do that right away, close off the tag, because then you don't have any nesting issues. I guarantee one or two of us is going to have nesting issues where, you know, there's a tag not closed off somewhere in our HTML, and it's going to be hard to find. So the best thing to do to remedy that is just make sure everything's closed off right away. If I go to my thing here, I can see that the content's in there. I just have to start styling it to make sure that it looks more like this. The first thing that I notice is there's a line break after our and interesting. So each of these words are on their own line. So what I might want to do is come back over to my code, and I'm just going to put a break tag. Remember break tags? They're one of those weird tags that kind of just live on their own. There's no opening or closing for this particular tag, but what it does is it breaks the line. So I've saved that, and I go back over, and we can see that they're at least on their own line right now. Okay, so H1s. Let's actually style this a little bit right now. If I select my source, which is styles.css, I see that these are all of the IDs that I have made. But what if I want to make my own? For instance, I want to style this H1. We can kind of pretend that all of our H1s in this website are going to look exactly like this. So instead of making a class or an ID, what I would suggest, if you know that one particular item is going to look the same across the whole website, for instance, if this paragraph look and feel is pretty much consistent throughout the whole website for paragraphs, then I would just style the whole paragraph. And what I mean by that is, if I come over here and I just make a new selector and I call it H1 just for the tag itself, I can now style all of the H1s globally. Okay? So what I'm going to do for the H1 is first I am going to pick a font, or actually colors. So if I go to my Photoshop document and I highlight this text, I can find out what color it is. There it is right there, 464646. I can then copy that, go over to my color, and paste that in, and hit enter. And it's still coming up black. Let's just try to paste that in again. There we go. That's what we want. So we can get that gray in there. The font family. So we want to click on default font. And if we look at our font stack right now, there is an instance of Myriad Pro in there. So I'm just going to click that, but you'll notice that this font stack right here says Gil Sans first, Gil Sans MT next. If you don't have either of those two, then finally go to Myriad Pro. So I'm just going to choose that font family, and we know from our document here that it is indeed 48 pixels. So I'm going to choose the font size of pixels and type in 48, hit enter, there we go. And everything's pretty much set up. If I file save all and go to my browser and preview it, it's definitely taking my CSS, which I always want to check. But it still looks a little bold because if we actually look at our styles, it's using that Gil Sans. So I'm going to manually come into my style sheet here and find that H1 stuff that I've just added, which is right at the bottom, which I can change if I want. I can copy and paste that or move it in the selector stack. I'm going to take everything out ahead of that Myriad Pro and just delete it. There we go. So now it's going to start with Myriad Pro, then go to Deja Vu Sans Condensed, and then finally Helvetica Arial Sans Serif. That looks good to me, so I'm just going to type in the word regular as well, because that's indeed the font that we're using. And then I'll come back and I'll refresh, and it's looking a little closer now. It's still a little bold, but there are things that it can remedy that later on. There are things that get really picky, like line height, which we can actually change, but we're going to leave it as is right now. It's important to know that you can always come back to things in HTML later. It's good to kind of get, progression rolling along, so I could spend some time and really hammer this out and make it look exactly the same as my Photoshop document, but we also know that we have to press on and do other things, right? So like getting the containers. I like doing my whole layout really roughly first, and then going back and really doing the fine-tuning, like line spacing and stuff like that, because really we know that we have all of these selectors that we can always go back and edit further. Okay, so interesting history, our interesting history. So we know that we have to put the paragraph in there as well, which is on the other column. So I'm just going to grab this, copy it, and paste it in. But I'm going to paste it underneath this H1. And again, this is an instance of a copy and paste that doesn't have a tag. So we're going to wrap this in a paragraph tag. And now that it is, we're just going to duplicate it, or copy and paste it, I should say. So Command-C, Command-V. So now we have 2 paragraphs in there. And if I go over to my Chrome, if I hit refresh, you'll see that now we have some content in there. That's perfect. Now we just need to see CSS, or style this with CSS to make it look a little bit closer. Okay, so we know that there's 2 columns based on this sort of concept. If I take my slice tool and I just roughly kind of size out this column, we can see that it's about 450 pixels wide. So we're going to style this in its own div, and this area in its own div, give them widths and floats. If I put 2 divs underneath, or one on top of each other in my code, it's kind of what they do. They just go one on top of each other. It's until we give things widths and floats that they'll actually go beside each other. So that's what we're going to do now. So I am going to put a div around my H1 here, and I might give it an ID of tagline. Okay, and I'm going to put a div around my 2 paragraphs. And however you want to set this up, you can. I might do something like that, or just leave it up here. This way I know it's kind of tucked in together. So this is one div, this is one div. And remember, we have the about container wrapped around, and then over top of that we have the whole about div. Okay? So remember your nesting, it's very important. So tagline, we're going to give these couple paragraphs an ID as well. So I'll give it an ID of, I don't know, about paragraph. Okay, so I haven't made those selectors yet, but I have added them to my HTML. So let's add them in my selectors panel over here. First, I have to make sure my source is selected. And as you can see, there's nothing down here, but if I hit the plus sign, I can start typing in, let's type in tagline first. Remember, hashtag tagline. And since it's in our HTML already, it recognizes it, and I can just hit enter, and there it is. Now we can start adding properties to this tagline ID. So what we're going to do is, actually, you know what we should do first, is we haven't added any styling for this about container, which both of these 2 columns will be in. These 2 columns here will be inside of the about container. So let's style the about container first, making sure that this is selected, and there's the about container, and I'm going to give this a width of, remember we settled on 900 pixels, and that's all we're going to do at this point. Oh yeah, we want to center this content that's inside of about container as well, these 2 columns. So I'm going to say margin left and right auto, just by clicking on this auto button. Whoops, it's a little touchy. There it is there. So just making sure that that says auto. If we go in the style sheet and actually look, the about container now says exactly what we told it to using the WYSIWYG. So width of 900 and margin and left right auto. If we come to our HTML over here, we can see that now it's 900 pixels wide across, and it's centered. If I resize my browser, it stays centered, which is great. And that's because of the margin left and right auto. So now it's come time to separate these 2 using CSS, so we can have them one beside each other using floats. So we'll come back over to our source code. Just we'll start styling tagline, and There it is there, tagline. And I'm going to give this a width of, remember when we were over here, we decided that 450 pixels should be enough for this. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give it a width of 450 pixels. 450. And I'm going to hit enter. And I'm going to float this div to the left. Okay, so that's all. And if we want to double check and just have a look, here it is here, tagline, width of 450 and float left. Okay, so now I can start styling about paragraphs, which I haven't made yet over here, but I'm going to. And we're going to say hashtag about paragraphs. There it is there. So now we're going to say 450 pixels, just to be safe. We can always massage this later. 450, and we're going to float it left. Now let's save all, and then go have a peek at it in the browser. There, now we're getting somewhere. Now we have two columns. So this area right here is in a div that's 450 pixels wide, and it's floated to the left. These two paragraphs are inside of their own div called about paragraphs. These are also floated to the left, and they also have a width of 450. And because they're inside of another container that's 900 pixels wide and margin and left right auto, they're going to stay centered. So there are some things that I might want to do after this, and that would be to style this text. Right now it's just default. So, like I was mentioning before, I might want to style all the paragraphs in the website to look like this, in which case I think I'm going to do so. We know it's 16 pixels, and we know it's a different color of gray. So I'm going to use this information that Photoshop gives me, that I've created, and I'm going to style all the paragraphs in my website like this. So I'm going to go back over to Dreamweaver. I'm going to make sure my source is selected, and I'm going to say P, paragraph. All the paragraph tags are going to look like this. So I'm making sure that the paragraph's selected. I'm going to come up over here and say font family of, I'm going to again use this Gil Sans one and then just take out the Gil Sans and just leave Myriad. The color, if I go over to Photoshop, I can grab the color from that paragraph. It's B7, B7, B7. And so I'm going to add that. And for some reason it has to have the hashtag in there, but that's okay. The font size, what is it over here? It is 16 pixels, so I'm going to use that information and say font size of 16 pixels. There we go. So that means every paragraph in my whole website is going to take that on now. So what I'm going to do is just come over to Chrome so you can see it. And it didn't take because I didn't go File, Save All. And hopefully that works now. There we go. So now we're getting somewhere. It's still a little bit more bold than our concept, and it doesn't have the line spacing, but again, we're roughing this out as we go. We're chiseling away at it, and we can always go back and kind of fix things later on. The way I work is I like to see things really quickly, prototyping really quickly, and then going back and really fine-tuning. So I probably won't worry about the line spacing right now. I just want to chunk things out and get things roughly looking the way they should, in which case we are doing so right now. So that's about it right now. If you get to this point, I would be happy with it. The only other thing that I might want to do is give this white space right here from our concept to our HTML document. So a couple different ways we could do that. We have up here a header div, and if I look at my code here, I'll double click on this to open it back up. We have a header container that we could add something to push everything below it down. So remember, padding is on the inside, margins are on the outside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over into my header container styles, and I'm going to add a margin to the bottom of, let's say, 40 pixels. Hit enter, and I'm going to go File, Save All. And what should happen now if I refresh my browser is there's going to be a margin of 40 pixels underneath this div. So I'm going to hit refresh. And hey, look at that, it's making me look bad. Header container, 40 pixels. And I'm just going to, I always double check in my styles. Header container. I actually didn't put it in for some reason. I can write it in though. So if this sort of thing happens, I mean, it's frustrating, but you know, sometimes you have to restart the program or restart the machine. I'm just going to say margin bottom 40 pixels. And more often than not, you'll probably want to come in here and start playing around with the code As long as you know where it is, you know, it's quicker to change things in here rather than going through the CSS designer, which is beautiful, by the way. It's just, once you get used to where the code is, you'll probably want to be using that more so. And that did not work. So, margin bottom, what we're going to do, because we have the height on this one, I'm going to say margin bottom, 40 pixels. And there we go. There's 40 pixels there right now. If I want to question that, I'm going to put 80 just to see, or yeah, not 800. And then, yeah, so it's moving it down. So that's what we want. I've added margin to the bottom of this div right here, and it's pushing things down. The other thing that I could have done is, because we have a div containing all of this information here, I could have, which is, where is it here? About container, or even this div, the sort of parent div for about, I could have added margin top. So that would do the exact same thing as adding margin bottom to the header. So if you want to kind of really study positioning, look at the layout section of your textbook, and that'll help you along as well. Okay, so I'm done with this section for now, the header section, and this about area section. I'm going to close that up for now. Oops. What I want to do now is start hashing out the next section, which is the how area. Now I'm going to leave this to you, but I'm going to give a quick tutorial on how to do this next week as well. I want to see what everybody kind of brings back. If we look at this concept, remember, there's just one div here. I'm going to use my actual move tool. There's one div here, one div here, one div here. That's 3. And keep in mind, they have to fit into this 900 pixels area, which you're going to give inside of the how container as far as properties go over here. Okay, so that's that. Remember, you can reach me by email. It's just cmartin@conestogac.on.ca if you're having any issues. Wednesday is kind of my open day for that sort of thing. Or just send an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right, thanks. And I will get some basically some feedback from you guys next time I see you, and see where we can go from here. Okay? Thank you.